Harper had exactly 23 minutes to get Logan to school, swing by the coffee shop for an overpriced latte she could barely justify, and settle in for a full workday in her tiny home office before the client call started. She was already running 2 minutes behind, which meant she'd have to drive slightly over the speed limit, pretend she hadn't forgotten to sign Logan's permission slip, and somehow look like a competent adult when she joined a Zoom meeting with people who used phrases like low-hanging fruit and let's circle back. Logan, meanwhile, had different priorities. He was fixated on his school's genealogy project, which had been the sole topic of conversation for 3 days. Every sentence began with, "Did you know?" followed by an obscure fact about Vikings, distant cousins, or how people's ears were somehow connected to their heritage. "Did you know redheads have a higher pain tolerance?" Logan announced, stuffing a granola bar into his backpack. "Then you're out of luck, kid," Harper said, grabbing her keys. "Your pain tolerance is officially average. But I could have Viking blood. Or be related to a pirate." Logan's enthusiasm was unshaken. "Miss Jennings says DNA never lies." "Miss Jennings is about to learn how chaotic our family tree is," Harper muttered. She didn't mind the project. It was cute, educational, and required minimal effort on her part. The school had provided DNA kits for parents and children to submit samples, and all she had to do was swab Logan's cheek, send it in, and let technology do the rest. Easy. The sample had gone out weeks ago, joining a sea of other submissions from kids equally excited to find out whether they were distant relatives of Napoleon. Logan had been giddy at the prospect of discovering something fascinating about their ancestry. Harper had smiled and played along, not giving it much thought. Until now. The school's family heritage night was packed with parents politely pretending to be interested in third graders' colorful poster boards covered in crayon-drawn family trees. Harper was in the middle of an excruciatingly long conversation with Logan's classmate's mother, something about organic goat's milk and why preservatives were the enemy, when she spotted the table with the printed DNA results. She meandered over, more out of curiosity than urgency. The sheets were neatly stacked, names sorted alphabetically. She flipped through them, scanning until she found Logan's. Then she saw it. Her eyes traced the chart, the percentages, the comparison markers. Logan's DNA. Her DNA. A second parental match, missing. Her stomach dropped. She stared harder, convinced she was misreading. It had to be a formatting error. A glitch. Some tech intern had probably forgotten to enter Mason's name in the system. But the data was clear. Logan's biological father was not Mason. The gymnasium suddenly felt unbearably warm. The chatter of parents discussing gluten-free lunches and extracurriculars became muffled, like she was hearing it through water. This had to be a mistake. She scanned the paper again, as if looking at it a second time would magically change the words. Her hands, steady just moments ago, had begun to tremble. Mason wasn't Logan's father. The air felt too thick. She struggled to take a full breath, her lungs suddenly unreliable. A polite voice cut through her panic. "Did you find your results?" Harper turned, barely registering Miss Jennings standing beside her with her usual cheery smile. The word barely made it past Harper's lips. She swallowed, forcing her voice to sound normal. "I think there's a mistake." Miss Jennings tilted her head, glancing at the paper in Harper's hands. "Oh, the results are pretty accurate. Sometimes people are surprised, though. Family history can be tricky." Harper wanted to laugh. Tricky? Tricky was forgetting a great-aunt's name. This was not tricky. She gripped the paper tighter. "There's a mistake," she repeated. Miss Jennings frowned slightly, her cheerful tone faltering. "We use a verified database, so errors are rare. But if you have concerns, you could always run another test privately." Privately. Right. Because that's what this was now, a private disaster. "Yeah," Harper said faintly, already folding the paper and shoving it into her bag. "Yeah, I'll do that." Miss Jennings nodded, seemingly reassured, and turned to greet another parent. Harper took 2 steps backward, then another, then abruptly turned and walked out of the gym. Outside, the cool night air hit her like a slap. She gasped, finally taking a full breath, but it did nothing to slow the wild pulse hammering in her ears. Mason wasn't Logan's father. Which meant she felt lightheaded. She gripped the edge of a picnic table near the playground, bracing herself against the dizziness. This had to be a mistake. There was no other possibility. Because there was no one else. 8 years ago, she had been with Mason. Only Mason. They had been together for years, young and stupid and thinking they had forever. She would have known if something had happened. Wouldn't she? Unless. No. No, she wasn't going to do this here. She wasn't going to spiral in front of a school playground while kids still ran around, hyped up on juice boxes and cupcakes. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone and texted Mason. "Hey. Can we talk?" She stared at the screen, willing it to stay normal. For Mason to reply with something mundane and reassuring, something that would ground her. The message delivered. No immediate response. Harper exhaled sharply, shoving the phone back into her bag. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together something, anything, that would make this make sense. Had there been a mix-up at the lab? Some kind of clerical error? She'd heard stories about DNA tests going wrong, about twins having weird genetic overlaps or hospital mix-ups leading to mismatches. Maybe that was it. Maybe. But a sinking feeling in her gut told her otherwise. She straightened, forcing herself to breathe, think, move. She couldn't fall apart here. She needed answers. Harper had never been the type to pick up the phone and demand answers, but she made an exception that night. The moment she got home, she tossed her bag onto the couch, pulled out Logan's DNA results, and stared at them like they might suddenly change. They didn't. The numbers were the same, the facts unmovable. Her hands were shaking when she dialed the school's front office. It was after hours, but the automated directory rattled off a series of extensions, and she jabbed the number for administration. Voicemail. She hung up and redialed. Still voicemail. This wasn't something that could wait until morning. She pulled up the school website and scanned the staff list until she found the email from Miss Jennings. It was late, but Harper didn't care. Subject, urgent, Logan's DNA results. Miss Jennings. I believe there has been a mistake with Logan's ancestry report. It says his biological father is missing, but that can't be correct. Please advise on how this can be corrected. She hovered over the send button. Too formal. Not forceful enough? It didn't matter. She hit send. Her knee bounced as she waited, refreshing her inbox as though sheer force of will would make Miss Jennings reply instantly. She needed this to be a clerical error, a glitch in the system. Some board intern had probably mismatched files, or the lab had swapped samples. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email. Miss Jennings, thank you for reaching out. The results are processed through an external lab, but I assure you, they are highly accurate. If you'd like, I can send the contact information for the company that analyzed the samples. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. Harper exhaled sharply. So much for a simple mistake. She closed her laptop, pressed her palms into her temples, and tried to think. This wasn't adding up. Logan wasn't some stranger's kid. She had been with Mason, and only Mason. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She hadn't spoken to Mason in over a year, not since his last half-hearted attempt at catching up with Logan had fizzled into nothing. She hesitated, then tapped his name before she could talk herself out of it. It rang twice before he picked up. Harper? He sounded half asleep. Is everything okay? She opened her mouth, but no words came. She had no idea how to start this conversation. There was no natural way to say, "Hey, remember our son? Turns out, he might not actually be yours." "Harper?" Mason repeated. She swallowed hard. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." A pause. "Okay." "When I got pregnant," she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "There was no one else. You were the only person I was with." A longer pause. "What kind of question is that?" Mason's voice sharpened. "Just answer me. You know there wasn't anyone else. Then we have a problem." She could hear him shifting, his grogginess fading into confusion. "What are you talking about?" She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Logan's class did a genealogy project. They sent out DNA kits. The results came back today, and they said you're not his biological father. Silence. "That's not possible," Mason said finally. "Yeah," she said, her voice hollow. "That's what I thought. Maybe it's a mistake. That's what I asked the school. They said the tests are accurate." "Well, they're wrong," Mason snapped. "Harper, this isn't, there's no way." She could hear the panic creeping into his voice, the same way it was gripping her. "We need to be sure," she said. "I need you to take a paternity test." Mason let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're serious?" "Completely." Another long silence. She could picture him running a hand through his hair, his go-to move when he was trying to keep from saying something he'd regret. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll take the damn test." Harper released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I'll set it up," she said. "And Mason." "What?" "Don't tell anyone." "Like I'd want to." He let out another sharp laugh. "Jesus, Harper." The next morning, she made the appointment at a private lab. Mason showed up looking wary, like he half expected a camera crew to pop out and accuse him of something ridiculous. He barely met her eyes as he signed the consent forms, let the technician swab his cheek, and left without a word. Harper didn't sleep that week. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind spiraled. The nights blurred together, filled with endless questions and no answers. On the 7th day, she got the email. Subject: paternity test results available. Her hand hovered over the trackpad. She wasn't ready for this. She clicked. Her eyes scanned the document. The room seemed to tilt. Probability of paternity, 0%. She swallowed against the rising nausea. Her mind rebelled. This wasn't real. It was some kind of elaborate prank, a cruel joke. Mason was Logan's father. He had to be. She pressed her fists into her thighs, grounding herself. There had to be a reasonable explanation. She went straight to her closet, yanking down the box of keepsakes she hadn't opened in years. Old journals, appointment cards, ultrasound photos. She spread everything out on her bed, flipping through pages, searching for something, anything, that could make sense of this. There was nothing. Every memory pointed to Mason. Every timeline matched. There were no gaps, no missing pieces. She hadn't blacked out and woken up pregnant. She hadn't had some dramatic summer fling she forgot about. She scrolled through old emails, desperate. There had to be something she wasn't remembering. And then, tucked between appointment confirmations and baby name lists, she saw it. An email from 8 years ago. A billing statement from a fertility clinic she barely remembered visiting. Her stomach twisted. The words were technical, but one thing was clear. She had gone in for fertility testing. And she had no idea what had happened after that. Harper had spent the better part of an hour rifling through every forgotten drawer, old purse, and storage box she could find. Her bedroom looked like a crime scene: receipts, medical records, and random scraps of paper scattered across the bed like they might collectively spell out an answer. The email from the paternity lab still glowed on her laptop screen. She kept glancing at it, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Mason was not Logan's father. There was no explanation. None that made sense, anyway. Her fingers dug through another stack of papers, flipping past hospital bills, expired coupons, and an old birthday card from her aunt who never remembered her actual birthday. And then she saw it. A folded, yellowing bill from a medical office. She frowned and smoothed it out, her pulse jumping at the words printed across the top. Westwood Fertility Center. She hadn't thought about that place in years. The date on the bill was from over 8 years ago. The same time she had gotten pregnant. Her vision narrowed, tunneling in on the details: her name, the billing code, the amount charged. The procedures listed were vague: diagnostic testing, lab work, ultrasound. She sat back, gripping the paper. The memory was faint but there, just a blur of a waiting room, a clipboard with a long medical questionnaire, and a doctor who had reassured her that it was all completely routine. Back then, she had been worried about her irregular cycles. She and Mason had been trying for a baby, and nothing was happening. Her OB/GYN had referred her to the clinic for preliminary tests. It had been one appointment. A few quick tests. The doctor had smiled and said everything looked normal. She had left feeling relieved, never needing a follow-up. At least, that's what she had believed. But now, staring at this bill, her gut twisted. Had something happened there? She pulled out her laptop, her fingers moving fast. The clinic still existed, which meant she could request records. She hesitated over the contact form, already imagining a receptionist dismissing her concerns. "Hi, 8 years ago, I had an appointment at your clinic, and I just found out my son's DNA doesn't match the man who was supposed to be his father." Thoughts? She needed to be careful. Direct, but not dramatic. She typed quickly. "Hello, I was a patient at your clinic years ago and am requesting access to my full medical records from my visit. Please let me know the process to obtain them. Thank you." She hit send before she could overthink it. Her hands were clammy, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. If this clinic had anything to do with Logan's paternity, she needed to find out exactly what had happened. Across the city, in a sleek penthouse office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the skyline, Ezra Hayes was skimming through his morning emails. His assistant, a woman so efficient she practically ran his life, placed a new stack of documents in front of him, her voice crisp as she rattled off his schedule. "Your 11 o'clock with the board is confirmed, and I moved your investor call to Friday. Also, there's an email from a company called Ancestry. Apparently, there's been a match." Ezra barely glanced up from his laptop. "A match?" She nodded, already pulling it up on her tablet. "It's that genealogy site you signed up for a few years ago." He had signed up once, on a whim, after a particularly ambitious dinner party conversation about genetics and family legacies. It had been a brief curiosity, something he hadn't thought about since. She handed him her tablet, the email already open. "New close relative detected, a son." Ezra frowned. That had to be a mistake. His assistant raised an eyebrow. "I assume this is unexpected?" He didn't answer. Instead, he clicked into the account, scanning the details. It was a 99.99% DNA match. The name attached, Logan Collins. Ezra's pulse ticked up. He didn't have a son. At least, he shouldn't. He had been careful. Always careful. There were no gaps in his life that could explain a missing child. No one from his past who would suddenly appear with a paternity claim. This wasn't some forgotten relationship or reckless decision. He had never had a child. His mind moved quickly, his logical side sorting through possibilities. Either this was a deliberate scam or something else, something much bigger, was going on. He glanced back at his assistant, his expression unreadable. Find out everything you can about Logan Collins and his mother. Harper had pulled apart every drawer, every file box, and every forgotten stack of mail she had shoved into a cabinet, looking for something, anything, that could explain the impossible. The room was a disaster. Papers were everywhere, receipts from years ago, birthday cards she had meant to throw away but hadn't, and medical bills she had ignored at the time because they had been too small to matter. Logan's DNA results sat on her nightstand, face down, as if she could will them into irrelevance just by refusing to look at them. Her fingers worked through another pile of documents, moving too quickly, sending envelopes scattering onto the floor. And then she saw it. A folded statement from Westwood Fertility Center. The paper was old, the ink slightly faded, but her name was printed clearly at the top. The date made her chest tighten. 8 years ago. Right around the time she had gotten pregnant. She sat down hard on the edge of her bed, smoothing the paper against her knee. The details were clinical, vague. Diagnostic testing, lab work, ultrasound. Nothing alarming. Nothing that screamed this clinic secretly created your child using DNA from a man you've never met. But it wasn't nothing, either. She tried to summon the memory, but it was foggy, buried under nearly a decade of life. She had gone to the clinic because her cycles were irregular, and she and Mason had been trying for a baby with no luck. Her doctor had told her it was just a precaution, nothing to be concerned about. She had spent an hour in the waiting room filling out paperwork, answering questions about her medical history, her lifestyle, her diet. They had taken her blood, done an ultrasound, and told her someone would follow up with her results. No one ever had. Or maybe they had, and she hadn't thought it was important. Maybe they had called and said everything was normal, and she had been so relieved that she moved on without another thought. She stared at the paper, her mind racing. Had something else happened? Was it possible that appointment had been more than what she had thought? She pressed her thumb into the paper, a slow, sinking feeling creeping over her. If Mason wasn't Logan's father, then something had gone horribly wrong. She pulled out her laptop and typed Westwood Fertility Center into the search bar. The website still existed, which meant she could request records. She hesitated over the contact form, unsure how to phrase the request. Hello, I was a patient at your clinic years ago and would like to request access to my full medical records. Please let me know the process to obtain them. Thank you. She hit send before she could overthink it. Her knee bounced as she stared at the screen, willing an immediate response. She needed this to be a mistake. A mix-up. Some technical error that could be explained away with a 5-minute phone call. But a part of her, deep down, already knew. This wasn't a mistake. Something had happened at that clinic. And whatever it was, she was about to find out. Ezra Hayes didn't check his personal email often. In fact, most of the time, he forgot it existed. His assistant filtered anything important, and everything else, newsletters, pointless updates from services he never used, half-hearted attempts at networking, went unread. It wasn't until he was stuck in traffic, half listening to an investor call through his car speakers, that he opened his inbox to clear the clutter. Buried between a notification from his tailor and a reminder that his credit card points were expiring was an email from a genealogy website. He almost deleted it without opening it. The subject line caught his eye. New close relative detected, a son. The car in front of him lurched forward. Ezra barely noticed. He tapped the email, skimming it quickly. Ezra, exciting news. A recent DNA submission has matched you with a close relative, Logan Collins, an 8-year-old child. This suggests a direct biological connection. Log in to view details and explore your family tree. The words barely registered. His stomach dropped. A child. He refreshed the email, as if that might change the contents. No. The message was still there. His driver glanced at him in the mirror. "Everything all right, sir?" Ezra didn't answer. The traffic light turned green, and the car eased forward, but his mind stayed locked on the email. This had to be a mistake. He clicked the link, ignoring the rest of his inbox. The page loaded quickly, revealing a breakdown of shared DNA, probability percentages, genetic markers, numbers and statistics that meant nothing to him. Except for the 99.99% match next to the child's name. He stared at it. This wasn't some distant cousin or a glitch in the system. This was definitive. This was a son. And Ezra Hayes didn't have a son. At least, he wasn't supposed to. His assistant's voice crackled through the car speakers. "Ezra? Did we lose you?" He muted the call. The city blurred past his window, but he wasn't seeing it. His mind was already sorting through possibilities, turning them over like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit. He had never fathered a child. There were no old flames, no reckless nights that could explain this. There was nothing. Except now there was Logan Collins. He exhaled sharply and closed his laptop. "Change of plans," he said. "Take me home." His driver didn't ask questions. By the time Ezra stepped into his penthouse, the gears in his mind were already turning. If this wasn't a mistake, then someone had a lot of explaining to do. Ezra Hayes didn't deal in uncertainty. Uncertainty was for people who made rash decisions, who let emotions dictate their actions, who walked into situations blindly and then scrambled to recover. Ezra had built his entire life around the idea that nothing happened without reason, that everything could be traced, explained, and controlled. Which was why he had been staring at his laptop screen for the past 10 minutes, unblinking, as if sheer force of will could change the words in front of him. New close relative detected, a son. It wasn't possible. He exhaled slowly, clicking into the match, scanning the details. The child's name was Logan Collins. 8 years old. No father listed on the site. But what struck him was the name of the mother, Harper Collins. The name meant nothing. He sat back, fingers drumming against the edge of his desk. He had never met a Harper Collins. He would have remembered. His memory wasn't the kind that let things slip. His mind sorted through possible explanations. A mistake in the database? Unlikely, this was a top-tier genealogy service. A scam? Also improbable. It wasn't like he was careless with his personal information. That left only one option: someone had lied. He grabbed his phone and pressed a button. "Find out everything you can about a Harper Collins," he said. His legal team didn't ask questions. They never did. Harper had spent the last hour trapped in the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that made her want to scream into a pillow. She had already called the clinic twice. The first time, a robotic voice had placed her on hold for 17 minutes before disconnecting. The second time, a receptionist named Cheryl, who sounded as if she was filing her nails while talking, had informed her that all patient records required a formal request via email and that response times were approximately 4 to 6 weeks, depending on processing delays. Harper didn't have 4 to 6 weeks. She didn't even have 4 to 6 hours. She had fired off the email anyway, but waiting wasn't an option. If they weren't going to help her, she would help herself. She had been Googling fertility clinic lawsuits, medical malpractice cases, anything that might explain how a baby could materialize in her uterus without her knowing its genetic origins. Nothing made sense. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Maybe she was missing something. Maybe she should have been searching for. Her phone buzzed, cutting through her thoughts. Unknown number. Her pulse jumped. She stared at the screen. She wasn't in the mood for a scam call about her car's extended warranty, but something told her to answer. She pressed the button, bringing the phone to her ear. A pause. Then, a deep, controlled voice. "This is Ezra Hayes." I believe we need to talk. Harper wasn't sure what she expected Ezra Hayes to sound like, but it wasn't that. His voice was deep, clipped, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who never had to repeat himself. A man used to being listened to. She had no patience for that kind of man. She gripped the phone tighter, heart pounding. I don't know who you are, but I have nothing to say to you. Ezra didn't miss a beat. That's unfortunate. Because I have plenty to say to you. There was something unnervingly calm about the way he spoke, like this was just another meeting on his schedule. Like calling a woman out of nowhere to discuss their alleged child was perfectly normal. Harper exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her forehead. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but I don't have time for this. No game. A slight pause. I assume you've seen the DNA results. Her grip tightened on the phone. I have. And they don't make sense. Because I have never met you. So why don't you tell me exactly how your DNA ended up in my son? A beat of silence. Ezra's voice remained steady. That's what I intend to find out. The certainty in his tone made her skin prickle. He wasn't just looking for answers, he was demanding them. Harper's stomach churned. She didn't want this conversation, didn't want him in this equation at all. But the truth was, she needed answers just as much as he did. She shut her eyes briefly, inhaled. Fine. Where? 20 minutes later, she was pulling open the glass door of a cafe that, judging by the prices on the menu, catered exclusively to people who kept yachts in Monaco. Harper had suggested a diner near her apartment. Ezra had countered with this. She spotted him immediately. He was impossible to miss. He was seated near the window, dressed in a crisp, dark suit that looked like it had never known a wrinkle. He was the only person in the cafe who didn't seem remotely interested in his surroundings, too busy checking his watch with the kind of precision that suggested he scheduled his life down to the minute. Harper approached, her every nerve on edge. Ezra glanced up as she reached the table, his expression unreadable. Harper Collins, he said smoothly. She sat down, arms crossed. Ezra Hayes. He studied her, and she did the same. He looked exactly like the kind of man who would own half of Manhattan. Sharp features, expensive taste, and an air of authority that made it obvious he wasn't used to people disagreeing with him. Too bad for him. Harper leaned forward. Let's get one thing straight. I don't know you. I have never met you. And yet, somehow, you are supposedly my son's biological father. Ezra didn't blink. That's correct. Explain. I was hoping you would do that. A bitter laugh escaped her. Me? I've spent the last few days trying to figure out how a stranger's DNA ended up in my child. I have nothing. But you? You're rich, powerful, men like you don't make mistakes like this. Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. And yet, here we are. Something about his quiet confidence made her bristle. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't panicked. He was treating this like a negotiation, as if he could analyze the situation into submission. She exhaled sharply, keeping her voice steady. The only explanation I can think of is that you donated sperm at some point. Which means you knew this was a possibility. His jaw tightened. I never donated sperm. She scoffed. Oh, sure. You expect me to believe that? His expression didn't change. I don't expect anything from you. But I don't lie. Harper's hands curled into fists. Then what the hell is this? I was hoping you could tell me. The sheer audacity of the man. Her chest burned with frustration. You think I did something? That I somehow tricked a fertility clinic into using a billionaire's DNA? What, like I planned to raise a child alone, struggling to make ends meet, just so I could one day blackmail you? Ezra's gaze was steady. I don't know what to think yet. She shot up from her chair. You arrogant, insufferable. He sighed, rubbing his temple like she was a particularly difficult boardroom problem. Sit down, Harper. Go to hell, Ezra. She grabbed her bag and stormed out. Ezra didn't follow. But as she reached the door, she knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. Harper wasn't entirely sure why she had agreed to the second test. Maybe because deep down, she was still clinging to the idea that this was all some ridiculous mistake, a clerical error, a bad joke from the universe. Maybe because despite how insufferable Ezra Hayes was, he wasn't wrong about one thing: they needed absolute proof. And so, after their tense disaster of a meeting, she had agreed. No school-run genealogy kits, no room for error. A real lab, a real test. Ezra, ever efficient, had set up the appointment within hours. He had sent her the details via email, short and clipped, just like he was. Collins. DNA Diagnostic Center, Tuesday, 9 a.m. Address below. No pleasantries. No further discussion. She had stared at the email for a long time before responding with a simple, equally blunt. Fine. Now, a week later, she was staring at the results, her fingers gripping the printed paper so tightly it crinkled. Ezra Hayes was Logan's biological father. Her mouth was dry. Her stomach felt like it had dropped straight through the floor. She read the document again, as if the words might shift under her gaze and reveal a different outcome. They didn't. Across the small, sterile office, Ezra stood as still as a statue, scanning his own copy of the results. Unlike her, he didn't look shocked. He looked like a man whose suspicions had been confirmed. A man who had already started planning his next move. Harper exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her forehead. Well, she said, her voice brittle, I guess that's that. Ezra folded his paper neatly, placing it on the desk like it was just another business document. So it would seem. The way he said it, calm and detached, made something snap inside her. That's all you have to say, she demanded. You find out you have a child, and that's your reaction? Ezra's gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. I don't believe in reacting emotionally to things that require logic. Harper let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Well, that must be nice for you. Ezra ignored the sarcasm. The question remains, how? She dragged a hand through her hair, her breath unsteady. I don't know. I have no idea. You must have some idea, Ezra said. Her jaw clenched. I don't. Ezra crossed his arms. I find that difficult to believe. Of course, he did. Because he was the kind of man who believed everything had a simple explanation, who probably thought she had been careless or lying or involved in some elaborate scheme. But she wasn't. She was a woman who had been pregnant with a child she believed was Mason's. A woman who had built her entire life around that belief. And now, it was unraveling in real time. Ezra exhaled, his voice measured. Tell me everything about your pregnancy. She looked at him, exasperated. I don't remember every second of it, Ezra. Then start with what you do remember. She shook her head, exhausted. I don't even know where to start. Ezra leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Then start at the beginning. Harper let out a shaky breath. She didn't want to do this. But what choice did she have? I had irregular cycles, she admitted. Mason and I were trying for a baby, and nothing was happening. My doctor suggested I get some basic fertility testing done. Just blood work, an ultrasound, nothing serious. She referred me to a clinic. Ezra's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. What clinic? Westwood Fertility Center, she said. I only went once. They ran the tests, said everything was normal, and I never thought about it again. Ezra's eyes darkened, his mind clearly working through the implications. Harper folded her arms, suddenly feeling exposed. That's it. That's all I have. Ezra was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, I had tests done there, too. Her breath caught. What? Ezra exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand along his jaw. Years ago, after an illness, my doctor recommended I run fertility tests as a precaution. I went in, had them done, and forgot about it. Harper felt lightheaded. Her throat tightened. Ezra. I never donated sperm, he said, his voice unwavering. And yet, somehow, my DNA was used to create a child. The weight of his words pressed down on her. Something had happened at that clinic. And they were going to find out what. Ezra Hayes did not believe in coincidences. Coincidences were for people who lost their keys twice in 1 week or ran into their childhood best friend in an airport. Coincidences did not explain why an 8-year-old child carried his DNA when he had never consented to being a father. And yet, as he sat in his office, his mind replayed Harper's words over and over. Westwood Fertility Center. I only went once. They ran the tests, said everything was normal, and I never thought about it again. Westwood. A name that had been buried in the back of his memory, collecting dust for years. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline beyond the glass walls of his penthouse office. The details were faint, but they were there. A routine checkup. A precaution. He had been in his late 20s, just starting to scale his company. It had been nothing serious, a brief illness that left him run down. His doctor had suggested full blood work, including fertility testing, just to be safe. He had barely paid attention at the time. He had gone in, done what was required, and left. The results had come back normal, and that was the end of it. Except it wasn't. Now, 8 years later, those tests had somehow resulted in a child. He straightened, jaw tightening. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a sleek black folder. He kept records of everything. It was a habit drilled into him from years of running an empire. It took less than 5 minutes to find the file labeled Westwood Fertility Center, 8 years ago. His eyes scanned the paperwork, fingers tightening over the pages. There it was. His name, the date, the standard tests run on his sample. Everything appeared normal. But something gnawed at him. He flipped the page. There was an additional test, one he didn't remember agreeing to. Sample viability analysis. His stomach turned. He didn't need to be a doctor to know what that meant. They hadn't just tested him. They had analyzed whether his genetic material was viable for reproduction. His jaw clenched, a slow, creeping anger building in his chest. He had never agreed to that. Across the city, Harper was sitting at her kitchen table, aggressively refreshing her inbox. Nothing. No reply from the clinic. No follow-up from the records department. Her frustration mounted. She had spent the last 8 years believing her son had come into the world exactly as he was supposed to. Now, she was unraveling the possibility that someone, somewhere, had played a role in his creation without her consent. Her phone buzzed. Ezra. She considered ignoring it, but she already knew he wouldn't go away. She answered, bracing herself. What? Ezra's voice was clipped, precise. I found my medical records from Westwood. That got her attention. She sat up. And? I had routine tests done there, just like you. But there was an additional test run on my sample, one I never authorized. Harper frowned. What kind of test? A viability analysis. The words hit her like a weight to the chest. Her stomach twisted. Ezra's voice stayed level. I don't believe in coincidences, Harper. We both had tests done at the same clinic, at the same time, and somehow, 8 years later, We have a child together. Harper gripped the phone. This was not a coincidence. She took a slow breath, her mind racing. So what do we do? There was a pause. Then Ezra said, we find out exactly what they did to us. Ezra Hayes had dealt with scandals before. Not his own, of course. His name was carefully managed, his reputation meticulously controlled. But over the years, he had seen corporations crumble under lawsuits, billionaires toppled by exposés, executives dragged into hearings over unethical business practices. Yet, somehow, none of those stories had been as horrifying as the one unfolding in front of him. He was seated at the long, polished conference table in his office, his legal team spread out around him, laptops open, papers stacked. His lead attorney, Daniel Mercer, had just finished speaking, but the room was silent. Ezra drummed his fingers against the desk, staring at the file in front of him. Westwood Fertility Center. A place he had barely thought about since he had stepped into their office 8 years ago. And yet, here it was, sitting in the middle of his life, unraveling everything he thought he knew. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm. Too calm. Run it by me again. Daniel adjusted his glasses and flipped through a stack of documents. Westwood has been under scrutiny for years, though nothing ever stuck. There were rumors, whispers about unethical practices, but they operated in a gray area. Until now. Ezra's fingers curled into his palm. What kind of unethical practices? Daniel hesitated. Unapproved embryo transfers. Switching embryos between patients without consent. Using stored genetic material for procedures that were never authorized. Ezra felt something cold settle in his chest. Harper had been right. She hadn't lied. She hadn't schemed or manipulated anything. She had been used. Just like him. He leaned back, inhaling slowly. And you're certain this happened to us? Daniel nodded. We pushed hard. One of the former employees finally cracked. They confirmed that Westwood ran a quiet operation of miracle procedures, offering solutions to women struggling with infertility by using viable embryos from stored samples. Without consent. Ezra's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. Daniel slid a thick folder across the table. You and Harper Collins, your genetic material was used to create an embryo. It was implanted in her without her knowledge. Ezra stared at the papers. His name. Harper's name. The clinic's signature. His entire body tensed, but he kept his expression unreadable. Daniel cleared his throat. They framed it as helping couples who were desperate for children. But in reality, it was medical fraud. Ezra's jaw locked. Fraud? Daniel nodded grimly. Criminal fraud. The clinic had a long-standing pattern of manipulating patient records to justify these transfers. They told women they were receiving special treatments, but in reality, they were implanting embryos taken from other patients' samples. Your case wasn't even the only one, just the first one we can prove beyond doubt. Ezra's stomach turned. He pushed back his chair abruptly and stood, pacing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out below him, endless and glittering, but all he could think about was Logan. His son. A child who should not have existed. A child he had never known about, not because of a decision or a mistake, but because a clinic had stolen his DNA and created a life without his permission. A child who had spent his entire life believing another man was his father. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaling through his nose. This was not something he could ignore. He turned back toward the table. Does she know? Daniel hesitated. Not yet. Ezra grabbed the folder and his keys. Then she's about to. Harper hadn't been expecting company. Which was why, when the knock came, she was still in sweatpants, hair in a messy bun, a half-eaten peanut butter and jelly sandwich sitting on a plate beside her laptop. She frowned. Knocks at this hour were rarely good news. She wiped her hands on a napkin and pulled open the door, then immediately wished she hadn't. Ezra stood there, sharp and unyielding as ever, dressed in an expensive coat that looked wildly out of place against the backdrop of her cramped hallway. Her stomach twisted. His expression told her everything before he even spoke. She stepped back. What? Ezra didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested he never hesitated in doorways. He dropped a thick folder onto her kitchen counter. "We have answers," he said. Harper stared at the folder like it might explode. She folded her arms, forcing her voice to stay steady. "What am I looking at?" Ezra's face was unreadable. "The truth." She swallowed. Ezra didn't do small talk, apparently. She reached for the folder, hands slightly unsteady, and flipped it open. And then she read. Each word landed like a punch. Her breath hitched. The words blurred for a second, her fingers tightening on the pages. She inhaled sharply, like the wind had been knocked out of her. The papers shook slightly in her hands. She wasn't just part of some administrative mistake. She wasn't part of some one-time mix-up. She had been part of a deliberate scheme. She had spent her pregnancy believing she was carrying Mason's child, believing that her body had created this little person inside of her. But in reality, Logan had been created in a lab. With a stranger. Without her permission. Without Ezra's permission. A hot, stinging feeling burned at the back of her throat. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, inhaling deeply. For a second, neither of them spoke. Ezra's voice, when it finally came, was measured. "They took something from both of us." Harper let out a hollow laugh. "Yeah. I noticed." Ezra exhaled slowly. She looked up at him, searching his face. He wasn't angry, not in the way she had expected. But there was something underneath. Something simmering. She didn't know Ezra well, but she knew men like him. The kind who were always in control. Who never let their emotions dictate their actions. But even Ezra Hayes wasn't immune to this. His hands were clenched. Not out of rage. Out of something colder. She studied him for a long moment. "What are you thinking?" Ezra met her gaze. "I'm thinking they made a mistake." Harper frowned. "Who?" Ezra's expression darkened. "The people who thought they could get away with this." Harper had always been good at adapting. It was a skill she had perfected over the years, navigating single motherhood, adjusting to every curveball life threw her way. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for this. She sat on the floor of her apartment, back against the couch, Logan's baby book open in her lap. The pages were filled with little moments she had carefully preserved: his hospital bracelet, his actual birth certificate, his first scribbled drawing of what was supposed to be a dog but looked more like a misshapen potato. Every single memory, every milestone, was suddenly tainted by the knowledge that he hadn't been conceived the way she thought. That some stranger in a lab coat had played a role in his existence without her consent. Her stomach twisted. She knew nothing had changed. Logan was still her son. He was still the same brilliant, funny, messy-haired kid who stole her socks and insisted on sleeping with the nightlight even though he swore he wasn't afraid of the dark. But knowing the truth about what had happened at the clinic made her feel like a stranger in her own life. Like she had been living in a story someone else had written for her. The weight of it pressed down on her. Across the city, Ezra wasn't handling it any better. He sat at the head of a long conference table in his private office, staring at a folder he hadn't opened in the last hour. This wasn't how his life worked. His entire world was built on control, on strategy, on anticipating every possible outcome before it even had the chance to occur. But this was chaos. A child. A son he had never agreed to. A living, breathing person who carried his DNA, his genetic imprint, and yet had been raised by someone else entirely. The sheer violation of it burned in his chest. He had spent years building an empire, making sure every risk was calculated, every decision airtight. And yet, somehow, without his knowledge, someone had taken his DNA and created a child. He clenched his fists. This wasn't just about legal action. He would bury that clinic. He would make sure the people responsible never worked in medicine again. But even if he did, it wouldn't change the fact that Logan existed. And that changed everything. They were going to have to figure this out. Legal action was just the beginning. The lawsuit was filed within days. Ezra's team handled most of it, assembling the most ruthless lawyers money could buy, but Harper wasn't about to let him take over completely. She hired her own attorney, made it clear she wanted to be involved. They both wanted justice, but Harper also wanted something Ezra didn't seem to think about, an explanation. She wanted to look someone in the eye and hear why. Why her? Why them? But even with all the legal motions set in place, it didn't change the reality staring them both in the face. They were parents. And no amount of legal action was going to undo that. Ezra had been clear from the start, he wasn't going to disappear. Harper had resisted at first. She didn't want to share Logan with someone she barely knew, someone who had no idea what it meant to raise a child. But eventually, reality caught up with both of them. Logan deserved the truth. And if they were going to co-parent, they needed to understand each other's worlds. So Harper found herself standing in the middle of Hayes Tech, a company so sleek and polished it felt like stepping onto the set of a sci-fi movie. Ezra had insisted she see it. If we're going to do this, you need to understand my life. She had rolled her eyes at the time, but now, standing in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, she realized just how different their realities were. This was his world, billion-dollar deals, private elevators, people waiting on his every word. It made her feel small, and Harper Collins was not someone who liked to feel small. Ezra walked in, his presence immediately commanding attention. "You're staring," he noted. She crossed her arms. "It's like stepping into an alternate universe." His mouth twitched slightly. "I could say the same about your world." That was his idea. To see her life, too. Harper wasn't sure what he had expected when he showed up at her apartment a few days later, but judging by the way his eyes scanned the cramped space, the pile of laundry in the corner, and Logan's drawings taped haphazardly to the fridge, she was pretty sure this was not it. Logan had greeted him with cautious curiosity, sizing him up the way kids did when they weren't sure if someone was cool or completely useless. Then, within 10 minutes, Logan had dragged Ezra into a board game battle, and Harper had watched, half amused, as Manhattan's most ruthless businessman was taken down by an 8-year-old with a plastic dinosaur figurine as his game piece. Ezra had lost twice before finally figuring out the strategy. Harper had expected him to be stiff, awkward, out of place, but to her surprise, he wasn't. He wasn't exactly comfortable, but he was trying. And that was something. Because this was their reality now. They were going to have to figure out how to be in each other's lives. Whether they liked it or not. Harper had never expected co-parenting to be easy, but she also hadn't expected it to feel like a high-stakes business negotiation with a man who ran billion-dollar deals before breakfast. Ezra wasn't just involved now. He was invested. And that should have been a good thing. It would have been, if not for the fact that Ezra Hayes had exactly one mode, total control. The first real argument happened in her kitchen, over something that should have been simple, school. Ezra, dressed in his usual immaculate suit, stood across from her, arms crossed. "I had an admissions meeting at Brookfield Academy this morning. Their academic standards are exceptional, and they have early STEM integration starting in 3rd grade. Harper blinked. "I'm sorry. Did you just say you had a meeting?" Ezra's expression didn't shift. "Yes." Harper set down her coffee mug with too much force. "You scheduled a school tour without talking to me?" I'm talking to you now. Oh, that's generous of you, she shot back. Ezra exhaled, like he was trying to summon patience. Harper, Logan is happy, she interrupted. Logan is happy. He loves his school. He loves his teachers. He has friends. Ezra didn't budge. He could have more. He could have better. Harper's jaw clenched. Better than what, Ezra? Better than a normal childhood? You're misunderstanding me. No, I think I understand perfectly. You want to optimize him like he's one of your investments. Ezra's eyes narrowed. That's not what this is. Harper folded her arms. Then explain it to me. Ezra's voice remained maddeningly calm. He's intelligent. He's already excelling in math and problem solving. I'm giving him access to opportunities he wouldn't otherwise have. Harper laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because, what? He's wasting his potential with me? Ezra's gaze flickered, like he knew he had stepped onto thin ice. That's not what I meant. Harper crossed her arms. Really? Because that's exactly how it sounds. Silence stretched between them. Ezra sighed. Harper, I just want what's best for him. She softened. Just a little. And so do I. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she saw the truth. Ezra wasn't trying to take over. He wasn't trying to erase her as Logan's mother. He was trying to be a father. And neither of them knew exactly what that was supposed to look like. Logan had always been sharp. Too sharp, really. The kind of kid who asked questions adults weren't prepared to answer and noticed things they didn't think he would. Which was why Harper wasn't exactly surprised when, one night over dinner, he put down his fork, squinted at her, and said, "So, is Ezra, like, my new friend?" She almost dropped her glass of water. Across the table, Logan kept studying her, his 8-year-old brain clearly working overtime. Harper forced a smile. What do you mean, buddy? Logan took a thoughtful bite of his spaghetti. Well, he's been around a lot. Picking me up sometimes. Coming over. Taking me places. And I think he's cool, but, he made a face. It's weird. Harper's stomach twisted. Of course he had noticed. He was a bright kid, and suddenly, there was this very tall, very serious man showing up in his life, one who looked just enough like him to make his brain start asking questions. Harper had known this moment was coming. She just hadn't expected it to be tonight, over a plate of spaghetti. She set down her fork. How do you feel about Ezra? Logan shrugged. He's kind of serious. Harper let out a small laugh. Yeah, he is. But he's nice. And he doesn't talk to me like I'm a little kid. And he's really bad at board games, which is funny. Harper smiled, even as her heart ached. Logan had already started liking him. Which meant it was time. She inhaled, steadying herself. Hey, buddy. What if I told you Ezra isn't just a friend? Logan blinked. Harper hesitated. What if I told you he's kind of family? Logan's head tilted slightly. Like a cousin? Harper swallowed. No. Closer than that. Logan frowned, the wheels turning. Then, his eyes widened just a little. Wait. Is he, like, my dad? Harper felt her chest tighten. She reached for his hand. Yeah, buddy. He is. Logan stared at her. Then, surprisingly, he didn't panic. He didn't cry or get upset. He just blinked a few times, looking genuinely curious. Huh, he said. That's weird. Harper let out a breathy laugh. Yeah, it is. Logan tapped his fingers on the table. So, like, was he lost or something? And you just found him? Harper smiled, but there was an ache beneath it. Something like that. Logan took another bite of spaghetti, chewing slowly. Then, after a long pause, he said, I think I want to get to know him. Harper squeezed his hand. Yeah, buddy. I think he'd like that. Months had passed, and somehow, against all odds, Harper and Ezra had found a way to exist in each other's lives without outright murdering one another. It wasn't easy. Not by a long shot. But they had settled into something that resembled functional co-parenting, not warm, not overly familiar, but steady. Reliable. And considering where they had started, that was a damn miracle. Harper still thought Ezra was too much. Too structured, too intense, too ready to turn parenting into a corporate merger. He scheduled things with military precision, operated with clear deliverables and expectations, and somehow made picking Logan up from school feel like he was closing an acquisition deal. Ezra, for his part, thought Harper was too chaotic. She was unapologetically unstructured, the kind of person who let Logan stay up late to finish a movie just because he was having fun. She took things day by day, whereas Ezra lived life 5 years ahead of everyone else. But they were learning. Ezra had learned that Logan didn't need an optimized childhood experience, he just needed to feel safe, loved, and free to be a kid. Harper had learned that structure didn't have to mean pressure, sometimes, it meant opportunity. They had figured out a rhythm. Wednesdays were Ezra's days. Pick up from school, robotics club, dinner at his place. Every other weekend, Logan spent Saturday and Sunday with Ezra, exploring his world, tech conferences, science exhibits, even the occasional afternoon at a private golf club where Logan mostly just rode around in the cart and made fun of Ezra's swing. Harper, meanwhile, made sure that Logan still had movie marathons, backyard soccer games, and lazy Sunday mornings eating pancakes in pajamas. They disagreed constantly. Ezra wanted Logan in prestigious summer programs for advanced students. Harper wanted him to climb trees and eat popsicles until his lips turned blue. Ezra wanted Logan to take Mandarin lessons. Harper wanted him to keep playing soccer with his friends, even if he wasn't the best on the team. Ezra wanted rules and structure. Harper wanted freedom and warmth. There were arguments, sometimes heated, but they were never mean. They learned to meet in the middle. Ezra let go of micromanaging Logan's life like a corporate agenda. Harper conceded that sometimes, structure wasn't the enemy. Most importantly, they both showed up. And Logan? Logan thrived in a way Harper had never expected. Maybe it was because kids were naturally adaptable. Maybe it was because, despite everything, despite how bizarre and unlikely and unfair this entire situation had been, Logan had two parents who showed up. Two parents who, against all odds, had found a way to exist in each other's worlds without completely combusting. He bounced between their lives like it was the most natural thing in the world. One day, he was in Harper's kitchen, elbow deep in cookie dough, his face smeared with flour. The next, he was sitting in a pristine conference room at Ezra's office, tapping on a tablet while some tech executive explained machine learning to him like he was a junior partner. He had questions, of course. Endless ones. Harper had fielded most of them at bedtime, when his brain tended to get philosophical. Do I have your nose or Ezra's? Why do I like coding? Do you think that's an Ezra thing? Do you think Ezra would beat you in a race? No offense, Mom, but he does look faster. Harper had patiently explained again and again that genetics didn't dictate everything, that he was his own person, that he didn't have to be a copy of either of them. But Ezra? Ezra had answered differently. When Logan had asked him, "Am I like you?" Ezra had taken a long moment before answering. Then, in his usual even tone, he had said, "You're like you. And that's the best thing you could be." Harper had overheard the exchange. And, for the first time in months, she hadn't felt the urge to roll her eyes at Ezra. Because maybe, just maybe, he was getting it. It wasn't about shaping Logan into a version of himself. It was about showing up. About being present. And now, months later, standing in the packed gymnasium of Logan's school, Harper realized just how far they had all come. It was a simple school event, nothing extravagant, just a showcase where parents shuffled in, clutching paper programs, murmuring about how quickly time flies while kids fidgeted excitedly on stage. Harper sat near the front, wedged between parents she only vaguely knew, and waited for Logan's turn. Ezra sat beside her. Not uncomfortably. Not reluctantly. Just there. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Then Logan stepped onto the stage. He looked out at the audience, scanning the rows. His eyes flickered over the sea of faces until he found them. And then, he smiled. A real, bright, unburdened smile. Harper felt something in her chest tighten. She glanced at Ezra, and to her surprise, he was already looking at her. Not with regret. Not with frustration. Just understanding. This wasn't the life either of them had planned. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't simple. But they had made the best of it. And that was enough.